And this afternoon we have Union of Concerned Scientists with the book Fukushima, The Story of a Nuclear Disaster, which is of course the account of events at Fukushima Daiichi power plant in March 2011. And the Union of Concerned Scientists is a nonprofit science advocacy group that uses knowledge of the scientific community to create innovative and practical solutions to environmental and health problems. I'm now going to pass the microphone to Elliot Nagin. He is the Director of News and Commentary at UCS, and he works with the media to promote the work of the nuclear power and global security programs. Prior to joining UCS, Elliot was the Washington Communications Director for the Natural Resources Defense Council. Please welcome Elliot Nagin.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for coming on this dreary Saturday afternoon. And remember that we're being videotaped, so when you ask your questions, keep it clean because this is a family show. Anyway, as Anton told you, my name is Elliot Nagin, and I'm the Director of News and Commentary at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And before Ed comes on, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the organization that we work for, which we also call UCS by its acronym. And I'm also going to tell you a little bit about why Ed and his co-authors were perfectly placed to write this book on Fukushima. First, if you're not familiar with UCS, it's been around for more than 4 decades, and it's been the country's leading independent nuclear safety watchdog since its inception. In January 1979, for example, some of you might have been around back then, you might remember that there was an event that happened just a few months later, but in January of 1979, UCS warned the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which also is known by its acronym NRC, about serious safety problems at 16 nuclear power plants around the country. And the NRC basically ignored the warning that came from my organization. And 2 months later, one of those plants suffered a partial meltdown. In fact, it was 35 years ago yesterday that this occurred. And of course, I'm talking about the 3 Mile Island accident near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Back then, UCS's in-house experts were Bob Pollard, a former NRC safety official, and Dan Ford, who wrote a book in 1982 called The Cult of the Atom. Today, our resident experts are Edwin Lyman, who's going to be speaking here today, and David Lochbaum, Ed's co-author on the book. Now, Ed has been on staff for roughly 10 years, and Dave, who was a nuclear engineer, came on board at UCS nearly 20 years ago. Now, Ed and Dave have continued UCS's tradition of holding the NRC and the industry accountable, and at the same time, they've been providing an invaluable service for the news media and the public. And that service they provide, that role, explaining nuclear power in plain English, proved critical in March 2011 when an earthquake and tsunami devastated the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear facility in Japan. In the days and weeks following that disaster, Ed and Dave were everywhere. They held telephone press briefings 12 days in a row, often with as many as 125 reporters online, and patiently answered their questions for hours. They testified at a series of congressional hearings. They appeared on network and cable news shows, and they published reams of commentary on our website. All told, they were featured in thousands of news stories around the world. Now, reporters were calling us day and night. I remember, I think I logged, one week I logged about more than 80 hours, close to 100 hours. We were working all the time. It was insane. And quite a number of reporters thanked Ed, Dave, and the rest of the UCS staff profusely for our assistance. And I'll give you some examples. One email from a veteran Washington reporter said, quote, "Your team has been a shining light of sanity since the beginning of the Japan nuclear crisis." Another longtime environmental reporter said, "Thanks for at least 4 decades of educating the press and the public. Times like this make us appreciate the Union of Concerned Scientists." And a grizzled energy reporter complimented us for helping the many reporters covering the disaster who knew next to nothing about nuclear power. There was such a need for information. News organizations had to press even music writers and art critics into service to cover this story because they weren't prepared to cover it. So they really relied quite heavily on UCS. And this reporter said, quote, "It's too bad this beat is ignored most of the time," he wrote. "The folks, your folks are doing a service with this daily information and your patients. You guys are the best." Now, Ed even received kudos from an NRC staffer, which is unusual. After reading an analysis Ed posted on the very first day of the disaster, he emailed a link to Ed's blog to his colleagues and said, quote, "One of the most coherent accounts I have yet to come across." Now, this overwhelming interest in all things Fukushima prompted Ed and Dave to team up with a former nuclear beat reporter, Susan Stranahan, who led the Philadelphia Inquirer's Pulitzer Prize-winning efforts to cover the disaster at 3 Mile Island. It took them nearly 3 years to research and write this book, and their hard work shows. They succeeded in producing a book that one reviewer aptly described as, quote, a gripping, suspenseful page turner that also provides a clear-eyed look at the challenges facing nuclear power here at home. So now I've primed you now that I've primed you to buy this book, let me briefly tell you about Dr. Ed Lyman. Ed joined, as I mentioned earlier, Ed has been working at UCS for roughly 10 years. He joined in 2003 as a senior scientist in UCS's Global Security Program, and he covers a range of issues. Over the years, he's built an international reputation as an expert in nuclear power security and safety, as well as nuclear proliferation and nuclear terrorism. And before joining UCS, Ed was president of the Nuclear Control Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based organization that focuses mainly on proliferation. And before that, he did his postdoctoral work at Princeton and earned a doctorate in physics at Cornell. So now I've said enough here. I'll turn it over to Ed. Thanks for being here.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Elliot. Is it on? Okay. Thank you, Anton, to Politics and Prose for hosting this event today. Being from the Washington, D.C. policy community, I would usually now turn to a 50-slide PowerPoint presentation, but I understand that the folks here don't like that too much, so I'm just going to try to wing it. We had 4 main objectives in writing the book Fukushima, The Story of a Nuclear Disaster. The first one is that my colleagues and I wanted to write a book that was as accurate as possible. In the aftermath of the accident, for months afterward, there was so much misinformation flying around, contradictory accounts, even from official sources, that it was very hard to understand the core issues about the accident. And so we thought that it really was incumbent to develop an account that was as clear as possible. The issues are very technical, but we wanted to try to tell that story not only accurately, but also in a way that was fairly understandable to the general public. And so I think we have succeeded at that. And in doing that, we went through multiple official accounts, detailed technical reports, and tens of thousands of pages of internal emails that were released under the Freedom of Information Act by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Department of Energy, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and the White House and other organizations. So we read a lot of that stuff so that you don't have to. And we distilled the essence of the accident in a rather concise way. Now, we did want to tell it in an accessible style because fundamentally we think that this is a narrative with a human element. It's fundamentally a story of institutional folly and the failure of bureaucracies to protect the public. It's also a study of the heroism of the workers at the Fukushima site. And finally, it's a story of human tragedy because ultimately nuclear energy, the consequences of a nuclear accident have a human toll. And that, working in Washington, I feel is often lost among the green eye shades who sit and calculate the acceptable risks of accidents and ignore the actual human toll of what they're talking about, which is the potential for illness, for damage to property and livelihoods. So it's very important that the focus on the human aspects of this accident be established. Another issue that we felt was very important to understand was the root causes of the accident, to inform the question of, can something like Fukushima happen here in the United States? Now, after the accident, the nuclear industry all over the world and regulators went into defensive mode and tried to split hairs and explain that what happened in Japan was somehow very specific to Japan's own situation and didn't have much bearing to nuclear power around the world. We think that that analysis was flawed, and we needed to explain why. Ultimately, Fukushima, the root cause of Fukushima was regulatory complacency and the idea that such events simply couldn't happen, and because they couldn't happen, there was no need to spend a lot of time and money trying to prevent them. That attitude was pervasive all around the world, and even today, 3 years after the accident, we're afraid that it still reigns in the regulatory community and the industry. So assuming that the answer is yes, that Fukushima can happen here if we don't take the steps to prevent it, what are the steps that we need to take? And so the book analyzes what the root causes are. We look at what the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and other countries have done in response to the accident. We analyze that, and then we come to our own conclusions. And our basic conclusion is that more needs to be done because, as I said, as long as the attitude of this can't happen here pervades decision-making in Washington and other countries, we're not going to take the steps that we need to make sure that Fukushima is not going to have a repeat performance somewhere else, even in the United States. So now the book has an account of the reasons for the accident and a narrative describing the course of the accident and what did happen on March 11th, 2011 at the Fukushima Daiichi plant in Japan. Well, the accident was first initiated by an earthquake, which was larger than the plant was designed to withstand. That earthquake had the consequence of taking out off-site electrical power to the plant because transmission lines generally don't do well when you have very large earthquakes. So the plant lost off-site power. Now, nuclear power plants don't do very well when they don't have a source of electrical power because paradoxically, even though a nuclear power plant generates electricity, it depends on external independent sources of electricity to operate the motors that drive the cooling pumps that keep the reactor core cool and prevent it from overheating. So plants are equipped with emergency backup diesel generators. So if they lose off-site power, these generators will start up, hopefully, and provide enough power to keep the fuel from overheating until all power can be restored. And that's what happened in Fukushima. They had 13 diesel generators. This is a site with 6 nuclear reactors. They had 13 diesel generators, and they all started up normally. But 45 minutes later, the second punch of the 1-2 punch happened, and the plant was inundated by a tsunami, which was higher than the design of the plant was going to accommodate, and higher than regulators had required the plant to be able to withstand. So the tsunami, which was on almost 50 feet high, swamped the defenses of the site. It flooded the diesel generators. It flooded the switchgear, which even more importantly carried electricity from the diesel generators to other parts of the plant. And it also swamped most of the batteries. These plants are also equipped with large batteries which provide DC power. So even if you lose all your alternating current power, you still have the ability to operate some of the controls and the instruments that you need to see what's actually going on in site. But this flood took out all that equipment and left the operators flying blind. Not only did they lose all electrical power, they also lost the means to observe what was going on in the reactors, and they lost the ability to control the valves and switches and other equipment that could be used to manually supply cooling water to the reactors. And that condition is called a station blackout. And what happens if you have a nuclear power plant with no electricity, no cooling water, the reactor core is going to start to overheat, and eventually it will melt. That core will flow like lava into the bottom of the steel reactor vessel that contains it. It will actually burn through that 6 inches of steel at the bottom and drop down into the floor of the containment building. And that's what's believed to have happened at 3 of the reactors at Fukushima Daiichi. Now, nuclear reactors are something like Russian nesting dolls. The industry likes to say they have multiple layers of protection. You have nuclear fuel, which is in the form of uranium oxide pellets. That's contained in rods inside a metallic tube made of an alloy of a metal called zirconium. Those rods are assembled into larger objects called assemblies. They are arranged in a core. That core is encased in a steel reactor vessel. That reactor vessel then sits inside another structure which is called a containment. And at 5 of the 6 reactors at Fukushima Daiichi, that containment was in the form of something like an upside-down incandescent light bulb, a thin steel shell, which is meant to contain radioactivity in the event that you had a core meltdown. And finally, that was contained in a larger structure, which is called the reactor building, which is a concrete structure, but not designed or intended to contain radioactivity. That's not its primary purpose. But if you have this kind of an accident, you can slice through all those layers of protection in one fell swoop if you have an event called a common mode failure, like a flood, which takes out all your electrical power. And so what happened is you lost the containment of the fuel cladding because the cladding overheated and melted. That fuel melted through the steel reactor vessel. It fell to the floor of the primary containment. That generated gases, and the heat of the molten fuel caused those gases to expand, and it caused the containment to leak, and that led to radioactivity entering the reactor building. But the reactor building was not designed to contain that radioactivity, so that ended up going into the environment. Now, there was another wrinkle in that conventional nuclear power plants generate hydrogen if their fuel starts to overheat. And that's because this metal called zirconium, which is very good in certain respects for a nuclear plant, is not so good if it's overheated because it can actually react with water vapor to form hydrogen gas. And hydrogen gas can be explosive under the right conditions. So you have the circumstance where if you lose control of the cooling, the core starts to melt, the cladding reacts with water vapor and generates hydrogen gas. That hydrogen gas can accumulate and eventually cause an explosion. And this indeed is what happened at 3 of the reactors at Fukushima Daiichi. The hydrogen gas, under pressure, leaked out of the primary containment into the concrete reactor building and caused explosions. So about 24 hours after the earthquake that initiated this whole event, the first of the 6 reactors had a hydrogen explosion. And that set back the ability to cool the cores at the other 2 reactors that had been operating at full power, numbers 2 and number 3, when the earthquake struck. So there was a chain reaction where the explosion of reactor building number 1 set back efforts at units 2 and 3 and eventually prevented the operators from the same sequence of events, first in unit 3 and then in unit 2, where you had, again, core melt, core eating through the reactor vessel, ending up in the containment, releasing radioactivity into the environment. So that, in sum, was what we experienced in that chain of events starting on March 11th. So the staff at the reactors were not sitting still while all this was happening. They were desperately trying to find sources of emergency power. They were looking for an electrical switchboard that hadn't been flooded so they could actually plug in a portable diesel generator. They only found one that was actually capable of functioning in the entire plant. They scavenged batteries from the parking lot, from cars, so they could hook up their instruments manually, so they could try to see what was going on in the reactor cores. And they were able to do that, but it turns out actually a lot of the indicators weren't even giving the right information. So they thought that the cores still had water in them when it's now known that they didn't. So no matter what they tried, it was too little too late. They brought in fire engines and they found portals where they could actually stick the hoses and try to flood the reactors manually. And some of that water may have gotten in, some of it may have not. They still don't know how much water actually got into the reactors. But what we do know is it wasn't enough to stop core melt and these hydrogen explosions. Now, so the outcome of all this radioactive, of the core melt and the radioactive release, is we had a large plume of radioactivity that was emitted into the atmosphere from 3 damaged reactors over the course of several days to a few weeks. 80% of that radioactivity blew over the Pacific Ocean in the direction of the United States. 20% ended up blowing over Japan, and due to unfavorable meteorology, some of that radiation was washed down because of precipitation and created a swath of contamination that extends about 30 or 35 miles northwest of the site. That led to conditions where that area was judged to be uninhabitable, and led to the evacuation of ultimately about 160,000 people. And today, over 3 years later, most of those people are still not back in their homes, and a large swath of that area is considered still an exclusion zone which is not habitable. In addition to what was emitted into the air, there's leakage into the sea. Now, these damaged reactors, because the cores melted through the steel vessel, they damaged the containments, there are holes in them, and they're leaking water like Swiss cheese. But you have to keep pumping water into the reactors because the cores are still hot. So even today, you still need to circulate water every day through these reactors. So what they're doing is they're pumping water in to the reactors. That reactor, the water is cooling the cores, but it's finding its way through these holes in the bottom of the reactor vessel and the containment into the basements of the buildings, mixing into the soil and mixing with groundwater. And this site, like all nuclear reactors, is sited near a body of water. In this case, it's sited near the Pacific Ocean. And there's a constant flow of groundwater through the site, mixing with the radioactivity that every day is continuing to build up and being washed into the sea. And in order to try to contain this, the Japanese have proposed building a wall of ice around the site by essentially freezing the soil so that water that does not flow through the site, but it's diverted and flows around the ice. And that's going to take years to actually accomplish. And in the meantime, they are pumping radioactive water every day and jerry-rigging tanks. A farm of more than 1,000 tanks has already been accumulating on site, where they're piling up, where they're storing radioactive water. A lot of this water, some of the water is leaking because the tanks have not been built to very stringent standards under these conditions. They don't know what to do with that steadily increasing quantity of water, and that's another ongoing hazard. So you have a site where you still have 3 damaged cores. The operators do not know the condition of the nuclear fuel within those cores, and it's going to take many years before they actually are able to send people in to actually investigate what actually happened during the accident. So to talk about decommissioning, it's still premature because we don't have a good sense of where the nuclear fuel is and to the extent to which it's spread within the plants. So you have to deal with that fuel, you have to deal with the contaminated water, you have to deal with the large area of contamination that was spread over land. You have to deal with the radioactive contamination being washed into the sea every day that's accumulating in sediments. Cesium-137 is the main radioactive isotope of concern. That has a 30-year half-life. That means it will persist in the environment for at least 300 years. And that is accumulating in sediments, affecting fisheries, and will affect them for many, many decades to come. Now, what are the implications of Fukushima for the United States? This is, again, one of the questions that we explore in the book. This was not simply a Japanese accident, and the conditions that led to Fukushima are present here in any other country where nuclear power plants operate. And that has to do with the simple fact that every plant is vulnerable to some unique condition of circumstances that where it was not designed to actually be able to withstand. Here in the United States, most of our nuclear power plants, and there are 100 that are operating now, were built in the 70s and 80s. They were built according to the knowledge at the time of the seismic hazards, of the flooding hazards, and that knowledge has changed over time. For instance, we know that many nuclear power plants are potentially subject to more severe earthquakes than they were designed to withstand. They're potentially subject to higher floods than they were designed to withstand. And so as part of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's review of nuclear safety after Fukushima, they're trying to deal with the question of what do you do with this population of plants where they're not protected to the degree that they should be because of new information or the inability to take into account information as it was developed in a timely way. We learned in post-Fukushima inspections that most of the plants today in the country actually are subject to floods, which are higher than what they are protected against. And it's going to be a big and a costly issue to try to deal with that question. Now, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has not been standing still. After the accident, they commissioned a task force to come up with recommendations. And meanwhile, they were still telling the American public that there was no real concern about U.S. nuclear reactors, that we were in a better place than the Japanese were. But it turns out that that reassurance was hollow. And we go into that in some detail in the book. But the bottom line is the procedures and the equipment that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission told the American people gave us extra protection in the event of something like Fukushima would probably not have worked if we had an event as severe as Fukushima, because that equipment was never designed for that kind of accident in mind. And again, it reflects this regulatory tunnel vision where the industry and the regulators simply do not want to keep asking what if questions. What if that doesn't work? What if this happens? Because they're afraid of this cascading effect on the cost of operating nuclear power plants. But we can't afford to continue to ignore and to not ask these questions. You have to have a questioning attitude. And so what we see is still lacking even today in the NRC's response is the application of this questioning attitude to challenge one's own assumptions. Because if you don't challenge those assumptions constantly, you end up in the same position that the Japanese were in before Fukushima. And that is one of the main messages of the book that we hope to convey. So I think I've talked enough, so I'd be happy to take your questions.
So I was a summer intern at the Atomic Energy Commission. That tells you how old I am. And many, many years later, I worked for EPA. My question is it economical to have a nuclear power industry in this country today? Because if we shut down the nuclear power, then we get Canadian tar sands and other things that have problems of their own. Or is it so expensive that if you put in all the things that you need to do to keep people safe and to keep the environment safe, does it make economic sense?
Well, the problem is today, nuclear power is under great economic pressure, especially from the low price of natural gas. Now that fluctuates, but before the price of natural gas decreased, nuclear plants that had paid off their debt, which are most of the plants in the country, could be run competitively because once that debt was retired, then it's really just the cost of fuel and operations and maintenance. But of course the cost of running this fleet of aging nuclear power plants really depends on what the safety standards are for those plants.
Exactly.
So we're at a situation now where the operating fleet is not only facing lower natural gas prices and increased competition, but also the prospect of significant additional capital investment in response to Fukushima, which is why the industry has pushed back so hard on extensive additional safety expenditures. So I think the jury's still out as far as the current fleet, but we have seen a number of plants that have closed over the last couple of years, and more are potentially in the pipeline. That puts a lot of pressure on the NRC to lay off as far as strengthening safety standards, but we don't think that's the right direction to go. You don't preserve the industry at the expense of adding the additional safety you need. So our position at UCS is that we're agnostic on nuclear energy, but we don't think that you can cut corners because it's a self-defeating proposition. You just look at what happened in Japan. It was a country where nuclear power was central to its energy strategy for the foreseeable future. And overnight, practically, their entire fleet of reactors was shut down. Now the current government is engaged in an effort to try to restart. We don't know where that's going to go, but for the last 3 years, they've had practically no nuclear generation in the country where it's important. So you can't, if you try to cut corners on nuclear safety and you have another event like Fukushima, it's going to take that option off the table altogether.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. This one, okay.
Hi, I'm Christy Wagner, and I'm beyond the point of concern. I'm at the point of outrage. I have two questions, Doctor. But before that, I have some correlative points. The people at Woods Hole, Massachusetts have been futilely contacting the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Environmental Protection Agency, and several more United States bodies and getting no reaction. Now, the Canadian government in 2012 has stopped testing seafood. The Canadian newspaper Vancouver Sun reported that cesium-137 was found in a very high percentage of the fish that Japan is selling to Canada. Cesium was found in 73% of the mackerel, 91% of the halibut, 92% of the sardines, 93% of the tuna and eel, 94% of the cod and anchovies, and 100% of the carp, seaweed, shark, and monkfish. My two questions are, because obviously the government isn't doing anything about it, what can we do, not to persuade, but to force the United States government to do something about this? I don't know what they can do to ameliorate the effects of Fukushima, but certainly they can do something to prevent it in the future. Number two, even if there isn't a legal precedent, is there a legal way for nationwide, the citizens of the United States to mount a class action suit against Japan, to sue their britches off for this? Because also, Japan lends us a lot of money. China lends us a lot more. But if we sued them, it would be far more than the amount that we owed them, and we could cancel out our debt.
Okay, well, I'll answer the second question first because that's easier. No, we can't sue them. And part of the reason is that the international liability regime for nuclear energy is fairly weak, but it stems from the basic principle that well, I'm not a lawyer, so, but my understanding is that the operator is going to be, well, certainly the manufacturer of the plant is going to be absolved of liability. That's the fundamental principle. But to establish whether harm has actually been done is a much harder question, and that ties to the first issue. And the statistics you read, we've been looking quite closely because there's a lot of concern about the potential impacts of the accident on fish and the impacts on people in the United States who consume fish or even who are situated in the West Coast. Our reading of the data so far is that the levels of contamination are still not at the level where it would be considered a major health threat, so that it would be very hard, I think, to establish that there was significant harm being done to Americans in general. Now, you can't say you don't test every fish that someone consumes, and so you can't extrapolate. I mean, but all that's really done is you sample small, you take small samples of catches, and that can't see everything. But the actual impact of the marine radioactivity seems to be concentrated more in the fisheries that are off the coast of Fukushima, some of which have been closed. Others are actually active. The government is sampling. And as long as they meet international standards, it's going to be very hard to make a case that there's excessive harm, because these standards are set by international bodies based on the idea that there's some acceptable level of harm to people from artificial radioactivity. As long as you don't exceed that, then you're going to be okay. And I haven't seen any indication that those international standards are being exceeded for seafood that are being exported. So we continue to study the issue, but we don't think that the U.S. or the people in the U.S. are a major injured party in this case. The people who are really injured are the people who lost their homes, are the fishermen who lost their livelihoods, and it's really a much greater concern still for the Japanese.
Hi. In the U.S., how much of a risk are the spent fuel rods where they're housed as compared to potential for a meltdown? And the second part is, since we have so many aging plants and they're eventually going to be decommissioned, have the costs been accounted for those? Because I've understood that it's very expensive to decommission a plant, and who pays for that?
Okay, so with regard to the first question, I didn't have time to get into the issue of spent fuel, although that was a big part of the story of Fukushima, and it's described quite extensively in our book. But the bottom line is that in the U.S., every nuclear plant is still storing all the waste that it generated over its lifetime. Part of the reason for that is the U.S. does not have a policy in place for where to take that fuel and create a permanent disposal site. And so the consequence of that is that fuel's been accumulating in spent fuel pools, and what they are essentially large swimming pool-like structures where the fuel is at the bottom of the pool and it's covered by something like 23 feet of water for shielding and cooling. In 2/3 of the plants in the U.S. called pressurized water reactors, those pools are at grade level. But in the 1/3 that are boiling water reactors, like the reactors at Fukushima, they're actually on the 5th floor of the reactor building. And so those elevated pools, in both cases there's a concern, but the elevated pools actually have a greater concern, and that was seen at Fukushima because when cooling was cut off to the reactors, it was also cut off to the spent fuel pools, and the company also have to deal with maintaining cooling to the spent fuel, which is on the 5th floor of the reactor building, and that led to a whole series of other complications. Here in the U.S., we worry about spent fuel because if you have an event where you lose all that cooling water in a relatively short period of time, and that could occur if there were a large earthquake or if there were a terrorist attack where the liner of the pool was breached. If spent fuel pool can actually catch fire, overheat, and melt, not unlike what happens in the reactor core. Now you have a little more time to intervene, usually in the case of a spent fuel pool, and for that reason, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the industry have always said, essentially their assumption is, if we can deal with the reactor, then we can deal with the spent fuel pool. So we don't need to worry about the spent fuel pools. And that attitude still persists even today. The NRC's conclusion is that spent fuel pools are safe. We say that you need to consider the potential for an accident or a terrorist attack where the pool loses its inventory in a short period of time, because the consequences of that event could be very large. But the NRC's conclusion is, even post-Fukushima, that we don't think it can happen here. Now, as far as decommissioning goes, I'm not an expert. Every plant has to maintain a decommissioning fund and escrow, and there are questions about about whether those funds are adequate, and that depends on one utility to another and how the funds are managed. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is supposed to review periodically the status of the decommissioning funds, and so again, it's in their hands whether or not they're adequate.
Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, my name is Craig Morgan. I'm just a local retired geezer here. Had a career in IT. What is your response to Richard Mueller of Cal Berkeley pointing out that the 86,000 survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki have experienced only less than 800 extra cancer deaths, suggesting that radiation is a milder carcinogen than tobacco, and also the response to the World Health Organization's review of Chernobyl, where they concluded that the damage from the psychological impact exceeded the damage from the radiation exposure itself, the psychological impact, of course, being fear of radiation. So,
well, my answer to that is that the impact of low-level radiation exposure, it is what it is. So what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that population, what formed the basis for the epidemiological study that's still going on, that's determined what the dose response is, particularly with regard to cancer, but also with regard to some non-cancer illnesses as a function of dose. So that population is the basis for the main basis for the estimates that we now use. Just to quote the number of actual cancer deaths arbitrarily without understanding that relationship to the actual doses that were experienced is a meaningless statement. Simply to quote that number out of context has no meaning. You can't make any conclusion out of it because you need to know what the relationship is between dose and response. Now, with regard to Chernobyl and the consequences of the Chernobyl accident, again, the issue is exposure and dose response. There have been estimates of the total committed dose as a result of the Chernobyl accident to the entire northern hemisphere, because the radiation did spread across the whole northern hemisphere, and those estimates would generally, you'd expect to see tens of thousands of cancer deaths as a result of that total dose commitment. Now, the World Health Organization study you're referring to only looked at the countries of the former Soviet Union, that is Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, and they did not examine the implications of that radiation to other countries in Western Europe, and we know that there was significant contamination in Scandinavia, in England and Scotland, in France, for example. So, so that study, you have to read what that study says, but it's not inconsistent with the other estimates. Now, to make a judgment of whether you think those numbers are something of concern or not, that's the question of how safe is safe. What is the acceptable consequence of a nuclear accident for the benefits of nuclear power? Those are different questions, but you should at least have a common understanding of what the outcome actually is to be able to even approach those questions.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I read an article recently talking about Japan having to bring in untrained, very low-wage workers to deal with the cleanup, and that some of the problems with the water tanks are exactly because they have untrained people building them and then managing them. And then, as you know, in the Air Force, there's been a controversy over the personnel overseeing the intercontinental ballistic missiles, and with lower morale because they're dealing with a problem that may never come. So I'm just wondering what you think is the best way to pull together a trained workforce when a cleanup needs to happen, and to keep them trained and to when that doesn't happen for decades.
Yeah, I mean, that is a good question. It does reflect the kind of larger issue of of complacency. And when you're dealing with now, I guess the Fukushima workers who are dealing with the cleanups, somewhat different category, because here you have a situation where you have a job where it's not that the job is sitting around waiting for something that might never happen. It's dealing with something that has happened that no one wants to do. So it might be in a slightly different category. But as far as the attitude, the complacency that sets in, this has to do with the real issues associated with trying to have the right level of vigilance against very rare occurrences. And that's the case when you're talking about the regulators and the industry, because they don't want to spend a lot of money and time worrying about things that they think will never happen. And they've come up with a whole methodology for how you rank events and apply resources to them. But the problem is, and we go into that in the book, is that the way they do those calculations is often worthless because there are too many uncertainties. It's also an issue with security. Nuclear power plants also have to be protected against terrorist attack, because a terrorist team could cause the same kind of damage that a severe accident could and lead to a similar outcome. But again, you need a security force that's ready to respond at a moment's notice, 24 hours a day, to an event that's probably never going to happen. And that's led to a lot of fatigue issues that you just let your guard down. You start to make compromises, you start to ignore warning signs, and that's an invitation to disaster. So how you deal with that, I don't have an answer to it. It just has to be reflected in the resources that you're willing to apply. I mean, if you have a boring job, you need to maybe distribute that among more people and give them also interesting things to do. But it costs money to train these security guards, and the industry doesn't want to train more than the absolute minimum. So again, it comes down to money and time.
My son lives in Pocasset, Mass., fairly close to the Pilgrim nuclear plant. And I wonder if you're able to say anything specific about the risks associated with that plant.
Well, the Pilgrim nuclear plant is the same design as Fukushima Daiichi units 1 through 5. That's a General Electric Mark I boiling water reactor. So it shares some of the same design flaws that contributed to the severity of the accident. Now, one of those issues has to do with the venting system. For the venting system for containment. Because what happened at Fukushima is they were in a situation where they needed to actually vent some of the gas from the containment. It was the heat and pressure caused by these gases could have potentially caused the containment to rupture. Now, they had what was called a hardened venting system, where you would potentially have the means to open the valves and to vent some of that radioactivity or that gas into the atmosphere and avert a larger rupture and a larger release. But because they didn't have any electricity, they weren't able to actually operate the vent valves from the control room. The only way they could do it was to go out into the plant to find those valves and to try to open them manually. And they had to look through blueprints. They didn't even know where some of them were. They went to one room, and we detail this in the book, and they entered it, and the radiation level was so high they had to run away. So the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has said, well, we don't want to be in that situation if we have an accident like Fukushima, so boiling water reactors should have more reliable valves. So Pilgrim's one of the plants where they're requiring these upgrades to their valve system, to their vent system. But the problem is it's expensive, and there's also an issue of whether, if you're going to vent, you might want to have a filter on that vent, because then you won't have to make the choice, do I intentionally release radioactivity into the environment to avoid potentially an uncontrolled larger release later. But the industry suddenly decided that filtered vents were too expensive. They were willing to accept the vent, but not the filtered vent. So they've put off a decision on whether to filter those vents for several years. I don't know about the status at Pilgrim, but I do know that a number of plants have asked for extensions and delays in implementing their venting system altogether because it's turning out to be more complicated than they expected. And I would actually have to check if Pilgrim's on that list.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for coming. I had a question concerning seismic risk. If the NRC concludes that certain power plants are subjected to a higher seismic risk than what they were designed for, what, from a technical standpoint, would the plants have to do in order to make themselves protected from the seismic risk that's actually there, as opposed to the seismic risk that they're designed for? And how much would that cost for a plant to make those sorts of changes?
Yeah, well, I don't think there's a general answer to that question, because it depends on what the actual vulnerabilities are. In some plants, it could require seismic retrofits, actually reinforcements to structures to prevent ceiling collapses, or it could mean you have to anchor piping more securely. So it really depends on the particular vulnerability at that site. It's not only, the risk doesn't only vary from site to site, it varies from one part of the site to the other. It depends on the soil. I'm not a seismic expert, but I think it's highly plant specific. But what the approach seems to be that the NRC wants to take is to actually try to do a risk assessment of how risky is it, even though it's subject to larger earthquakes than we thought they were, they would be exposed to. Is that a significant risk? And if a plant owner comes back and they've done a calculation, they say, well, sure, we could have that larger earthquake, but the risk's very small that it would have a problem, they might get a free pass. So I have a feeling that the way things are going, most plants are going to be able to get exempted from any significant seismic retrofits. And the problem with that is that no one really knows what the probability of an earthquake is. So it's almost, and we go through this in the book. I mean, in some cases, regulatory decisions are really based on fiction, and that's a dangerous thing.
Thank you.
Thank you. So you made the point that the regulatory agencies have been far less effective than they should be, and I was wondering if you would comment about how that is shared by regulatory agencies in other industries, such as oil and mining. And
Well, if you saw the Washington Post this morning and the article about aviation, there are a lot of parallels between the way aviation is regulated in nuclear plants. In many cases, you're talking about very low probability events, and the two agencies really kind of share philosophy and practices. In a minute, it's very easy to make parallels. I personally don't study in great depth other regulatory agencies, so I can't really judge. But there is a common language which, at least in the United States, regulatory agencies share, and that's the use of quantitative or cost-benefit analysis. To make decisions, you try to judge, if there's a new regulation, for example, you try to make an estimate of what the benefit is compared to the cost. And benefit, if you're talking about human lives, you have to come up with a way to convert the value of a human life into dollars. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's value for a human life is about $3 million, which turns out it's 1/2 to 1/3 of what other regulatory agencies use in their own calculations. So they've been debating whether they should increase the value of human life in NRC for about 3 years now, and they haven't come to a conclusion yet. So they might double it to.
Along that lines, in the U.S., what is the nature of the insurance regime related to nuclear power, and can any force be brought to bear there? And in Japan, just curious to kind of finish it up on TEPCO in the aftermath. What did they know? What do you think they knew or should have known, didn't tell people because they either didn't know or they didn't, want to scare folks like that as well?
Yeah, right, and you mean during the accident?
In the aftermath
right,
of the
right,
accident,
okay.
yeah.
All right, so with regard to insurance in the United States, there's a law which dates from the 1950s called the Price-Anderson Act. And that was established to give, to kind of bolster the fledgling industry by giving them some liability protection for building technology that no one had any experience with and that could potentially have major and very expensive consequences. Price-Anderson is still operative today. The way it works is it essentially establishes a level of insurance coverage that nuclear reactors are required to carry. And it artificially establishes that level. And it also imposes a post-accident assessment. So if there's an accident anywhere in the United States, all the reactor operators have to pay into a pool. And the Act reevaluates periodically how much that pool is. Today it's around $12 billion or something. So by essentially imposing an artificial limit on coverage that plants are required to have, it establishes a ceiling on their liability. It's not an official ceiling, but it's implicit. And it's also implicit that after an accident, once they've paid their assessment, they're not going to be liable for additional coverage. And so the assumption is the U.S. government taxpayers would be liable for anything above $12 billion. Now, the current estimate for the total consequence cost of Fukushima, including decommissioning and settling compensation claims and other costs, is upwards of $125 billion. So there's a pretty big gap at this point. And no one has ever explained how or who's going to be paying for that in the event we have an accident like that here. With regard to what TEPCO knew or didn't know, we do go into the book in some depth about the confusion in communications coming out of the Japanese government and the utility. In some cases, it was simply a lack of understanding on their part or confusion unclear language. I wouldn't say there was a lot of it. We didn't find that there were substantial attempts to actually cover up. It was more their inability to comprehend or understand what was going on. And one of the major consequences of that was, as we detail in the book, the fact that people who were at risk were not actually informed of that, and they weren't evacuated until they had already been exposed for a long period of time. And part of the reason was that reactors, and Japan isn't alone in this, we do it here too, we have these artificial emergency evacuation zones. Here in the United States it's 10 miles. In Japan it was 10 kilometers. But radiation doesn't stop at 10 miles or 10 kilometers, and so the government acted on the assumption that if you were outside of that original zone, you were safe. And because they didn't have good information on the actual amount of radioactivity that was being released, and they didn't have good radiation monitoring going on for a long time after the accident, that assumption turned out to be false in the case of people who were living to the northwest of the site, as far as 25 miles away, some of whom stayed there for a month after the accident before the government finally realized that they should have been evacuated. So that was a real human consequence.